Nepal is universally famous for its spectacular beauty, sitting right at the historic crossroads of two powerful civilizations. But today, we're actually exploring a really harsh, totally fascinating paradox. We're going to see how the exact same mountains that make Nepal a global icon are the very things keeping the nation trapped. Think about this core contradiction for a second. 8 of the world's 10 tallest mountain peaks are located right here. You've got these massive, powerful rivers pouring off the roof of Asia. From a resource standpoint, it literally looks like a nation of endless abundance. Yet, it remains one of the poorest in the region. So how exactly does that happen? Well, it's super tempting to just point the finger at the usual suspects, right? Corruption, messy politics, or maybe just plain bad luck. But honestly, those easy answers totally miss the deeper truth. To understand the real issue at play here, we have to bypass politics entirely and look really closely at the map. So, that brings us to Section 1, the Great Geographic Paradox. Geography is quietly doing what it always does, deciding the fate of everyone living inside the borders. Picture a strip of land roughly the length of California, but it's incredibly narrow, only about 150 kilometers wide. Up north, you have the towering Himalayas. Down south, the flat Terai Plains border India. And crushed right between those two extremes are the middle hills. These are steep ridges, deep gorges, and highly isolated valleys where most of the population actually tries to survive. Now, this highly crumpled, incredibly varied shape makes connecting the country to itself almost physically impossible. And in the modern world, that is basically a death sentence for an economy. As the saying goes, if you cannot connect to move goods, people, and ideas efficiently, you don't develop. You just wait. Which leads perfectly into Section 2, the impossible road problem. We all know roads are absolutely crucial. They're the most basic requirement for an economy. Down in the flat plains of neighboring India, building a road means flattening the dirt, laying some asphalt, and managing your budget. Simple enough. But in Nepal, you are literally blasting through solid mountain rock. You're stringing bridges over gorges hundreds of meters deep, basically clinging to cliff faces. The cost of building just a single kilometer of road here is astronomically higher. And you know what's crazy? The cost to build is only half the battle, because the mountains literally never stop moving. When the intense summer monsoons hit from June to September, massive rains completely destabilize slopes across the country. We're talking about landslides that can erase months of multi-million-dollar roadwork overnight. Communities that were connected one week find themselves completely cut off the next. Let's bring this down to a human scale for a second. Imagine you're a remote hill farmer and you successfully grow a surplus. Awesome, right? You've got extra food to sell. But to actually sell it at a market, you have to strap it to your back and hike for 3 brutal days across steep mountain passes. So what do? You just don't do it. The food rots and your local economy stays frozen in time. All right, Section 3, the hydropower illusion. Now, you might be wondering, hey, what about water? Because Nepal has it in absolute abundance. The Himalayas act like this massive frozen reservoir feeding roaring rivers like the Koshi, the Gandaki, and the Karnali. Experts estimate all this water gives Nepal a theoretical hydropower potential of 83,000 megawatts. To put that into perspective, that is enough energy to power much of South Asia. Yet despite that mind-boggling potential, the reality on the ground is a stark contrast. Currently, Nepal utilizes less than 3% of its hydropower capacity, meaning 97% remains completely untapped. It's a hugely frustrating gap between what's possible and what's real. So why is that gap so massive? Simply put, it's terrain that fights back. Harnessing all that roaring water means building massive dams and transmission lines deep inside remote, incredibly hostile gorges. You've got to drag heavy equipment up roads that barely exist. And once you finally generate the power, stringing high voltage lines across jagged mountain peaks is just an economic nightmare. The mountains create this wealth of water, but then they aggressively lock it away. Moving on to Section 4, the livability trap. You see, geography doesn't just block infrastructure here, it strictly dictates human survival. Up in the northern Himalayas, it's so cold and the growing seasons are so short that people are locked into mere subsistence survival. They survive, but they don't accumulate wealth. Then, the middle hills require farming on steep, precarious terraces that are super vulnerable to crop-wiping landslides. And the southern Terai? Sure, it's flat and fertile, but it's pressed so tightly against India that it functions almost entirely as an extension of the massive Indian economy rather than an independent engine for Nepal. Which brings us to Section 5, the altitude of ambition. Living within these strict confines creates this heavy, invisible psychological burden that economic statistics usually miss. When ambitious Nepalis realize the markets are basically inaccessible and the train won't let them build a prosperous future, they make a perfectly rational calculation. They leave. Nepal faces immense rates of emigration, and the remittances these workers send back home from places like the Gulf, Malaysia, and India, they sometimes make up a staggering 25% of Nepal's entire national economy. And sadly, they are caught in a brutal feedback loop. Geography blocks the initial growth. Because of that, the most ambitious and productive people leave. This massive brain drain weakens the domestic economy, which results in less tax revenue to build infrastructure. And with no infrastructure being built, the mountains just remain an unbeatable barrier. The trap locks shut. Okay, so how did they break out of this? Section 6. Working with the mountains. First off, they have to accept a really hard truth. The standard economic playbook is completely useless here. You absolutely cannot just copy-paste another country's strategy onto the Himalayas. The traditional development model of building flat roads, quick industrialization, and mass exporting goods, it just runs straight into a rock face, literally. Instead, Nepal needs a totally new development model, one that works with the incredible geography rather than fighting against it. This means focusing on sustainable tourism that leverages those stunning peaks without destroying them. It means targeted, smaller-scale hydropower that doesn't require moving entire mountains. And crucially, it means treating its location as an essential bridge between its massive neighbors, India and China, rather than viewing it as a prison. There's a saying, the mountains don't care about policy. They simply exist. And wow, is that a profound reminder? Political systems, leaders, global economic trends, they will all come and go. But the permanent, physical reality of the Himalayas is the ultimate authority here. It quietly dictates who can trade, who can eat, and who can ultimately thrive. So the biggest takeaway from this explainer is that Nepal's story isn't just some tragic tale of corruption or bad luck. Not at all. It is a story of immense resilience. It's about a nation waking up every single day, trying to physically and economically climb its way out of the very landscape that defines its global identity. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought. The mountains don't just make internal development exceptionally hard, they also leave Nepal completely at the mercy of its massive neighbors. It's a geographic dynamic that really leaves us questioning. Moving forward, how can Nepal possibly balance its survival and independence while caught in the geopolitical crush between India and China? Well, that is a fascinating question for another day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.